everybody. If you joined us on our last episode, we talked about Sabbath and sexuality, and now we're going to lean into a question that we got from one of our listeners. And so, Ellen, I'll hand it over to you if you want to share what the question is, and then we'll dive into it.
Yep. So the question is, how do I rebuild trust with my teen who hid a same-sex dating relationship for me for 4 months? Oof.
That's tough.
That's rough.
That's tough. So let me recap. If you didn't listen to our last episode, encourage you to go back and do that. But if you're here now, we're happy you're here. Talking through how Sabbath is a great opportunity for us to build a routine and a rhythm of dumping out our buckets of fear and big emotional situations, maybe not even big emotional, but just big situations that can sometimes feel really overwhelming. How do we lean into time of rest and connection and delight with God when big situations like this come up, like this question that we got, which is really hard. Like, those are really hard moments.
And even how to build it in preventatively so that in the middle of the week, when your kid asks, or, when you find out your kid's been in a secret same-sex relationship for 4 months, you're not, like we talked about in our last episode, operating at full capacity, and you have no margin to handle this big thing that feels like it's making your life crumble, right? So practicing that Sabbath really is kind of like bringing your car in for regular maintenance to make sure that you don't crumble, your family doesn't crumble when something big hits your family.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's lean into this a little bit. Let's envision, right? Like the person who submitted this question, you're going about your hustle of life, and you're taking your kids to school, you're packing lunches, all of these things. You think your relationship with your kid is going well, or there might be some tension in that relationship. When we're talking, we're just going to sit on this Sabbath topic with this direct question for just a moment. And then Ellen would love to hear from you as far as like how some practicals around how to rebuild trust with your teen. But let's envision, right, that you had just started leaning into the Sabbath practice and you had just started learning to like really rest and delight with God. I think one thing that would stand out to me would be we talked about preparation, which Ellen just alluded to, right? Like we talked about preparation as we are preparing and we are sitting before Jesus, we allow the space for him to enter into those situations. Because again, the truth is, we said it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's when. And that when for this listener was this week or last month or sometime really recent. And I think the immediate response would be to crumble or to just be like, start the self-doubt, the insecurity, whatever it is. But the beautiful part is that you can actually lean into God and be like, okay, God, who are you in this situation? You are still good. You are still in control. You are still the creator. My child is still beautiful and your creation, and you have such beautiful plans for them, even though this moment feels really hard. And who am I? I am still a good parent. I still love my child deeply, right? Like, and you can just pray and shower those things that God thinks about you over and over again in those moments of Sabbath, whether that is a day on the weekend or where you are right now, to be able to remember those truths about who he is, who you are, and what he's calling you to be as their parent, right? Like you are still called to love them and guide them and teach them. And so I'm curious, Ellen, how would you guide a parent who is in this situation to have to rebuild trust, as I'm sure it is so broken and can just feel so shattered in this moment specifically?
Yeah, well, oh man, first, truthfully, this has happened before, right? Parent comes into my therapy office and says, I just found this out. They've been in a secret same-sex relationship for months. I would first start with validating that parent's emotions. They are for sure going to feel tremendous amounts of fear, grief, probably shame, guilt, and devastation. And so just sitting in that reality. And I think, since we've talked about Sabbath is a great time to do that. That's not possible in the moment when you found it out and you're in the middle of making dinner or heading to work, right? You can't process through all of that. So stick a pin in it in that moment, turn into God briefly and say, I know we can get through this. We've been through worse. I love you. I know you love me. All those truths to remind of. I love my child. We're going to get through this, and then put a pin in it until the time for you to empty that bucket of big emotion, right?
Can
Then
I
during
ask,
this,
can I ask a question about that? So what would you suggest to a parent when they find this out and it's not the time to talk to your child about it? It's not the time, like you need space almost to
yes.
be able to process that. Like what's an appropriate response to your child if you're finding this out in the midst of the hustle of life?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you found out like through, seeing something on social media or something, right? And your child doesn't know that you know, I might keep it that way just for a couple of days to give you time to process so that you don't accidentally slip into reacting instead of responding, right? As their parent, you are called to respond to this, absolutely. But we never want to emotionally react to it. That has the potential to harm our connection with them. And actually, even though this feels really big and scary and devastating, this has the potential to build a lot of connection with your child. So that's what we're aiming for here. So I would, as much as possible, not respond in the moment. Now, if they blurted it out to you or they know that you know, I would just reaffirm all those things that you turning inwardly would reaffirm for you with your relationship with God. You want to do that for your child. I love you. We can make it through this. We've been through worse. We will figure this out together. Nothing has changed in my love for you. I need some time to process. Let's talk about this in a few days or next week when I've had time to process through this, right? And I would not mention it. I would not have them mention it until then. And then during that time period, I would make sure you are turning to God as much as possible, turning to your support system as much as possible, emptying those grief buckets, that fear bucket, all those things with God, processing through those big emotions. Then I would, after you've processed through some of your emotion, not that it's going to go away, but after you've processed through that initial part of it, I would try to survey with God your teen and or your child and what they've been through in this. Try to have compassion and validation for what they might be going through. That's not to say you condone how they handled it. You are definitely going to be hurt that they didn't tell you. But you can absolutely have compassion for how they got there, even if you disagree with their execution. So spend some time sitting with God and really trying to see your child, like Elroy style, right? Like the God who sees, like you want to see through those eyes. What was the pain that led my child to this? The fear that led my child to this? Really unpack that to garner some compassion. I would say if you're able, once that time comes for you to reconnect with your child, try to pull out that story, right? You want to know some details. How long has this been going on? What led you to this? Why did you feel like you can't talk to me about this? I would reestablish that connection. I would set up some boundaries for them around that. Absolutely. Work that out with God, your spouse, if you have one, your support system. Present that to your child. But I would say also there's room here during that Sabbath time with God as you're processing through your emotions, striving to have compassion for your child through God's eyes. There's also room for you to soberly judge, soberly assess any dynamics in your family that might need to be tweaked and adjusted to allow your child to feel a bit more comfortable with bringing some of these things to you. And that's not to say that it's your fault as the parent if this is to happen. You have no control over what your child does in that. But I do think as the CEO of your home, right, there's room for you to assess, what could I have done differently? Not that it's my fault, but what could be different in our family dynamic where we might be able to approach these topics or approach disagreement a bit more transparently, a bit more compassionately and lovingly. And then I would build those in.
I had a manager one time who asked a question that I think goes hand in hand with what you were just saying, which is like, what could we have changed to get a different outcome?
Yeah.
And I think that is like, if the outcome is, hey, I would have wanted my child to come and tell me this sooner and not feel like they had to hide it from me. Like, what would have needed to change in order to achieve that outcome? And to ask them, like,
Yeah.
what would have needed to change in order for you to tell me before? I think it is really, really hard to self-assess when you also feel hurt and you also are taking it so personally to be able to stop and hear that feedback. And so sometimes it might take time to be able to ask that question, but I think that it's, as a parent, I can feel this way, is like, it's really hard to humble myself to ask my kid that question because, like, the truth is I just want to, like, sit in my anger and I just want to be hurt and I just want to be upset. But yet I'm trying to teach my child to, like, feel so safe coming to me. And I'm like, oh gosh, like, I just want to be a selfish 7-year-old and upset but I'm trying to teach you to not be
But
that
that's
way.
why Sabbath is so key, because to this kind of big thing hitting your family, because that is the time that you do get to be a 7-year-old before your parent, God, right? Like you before you're a parent to your child, you're a child of God to your heavenly parent.
Mm-hmm.
And so you need that time to have a tantrum before God and say, how could this happen? How could they do this to me? How could you let this happen? Right? All those things that our 7-year-old heart wants to say before God, we need that time to tantrum, to grieve, to be afraid, to be angry before God. And then once we've processed through that a little bit, then we're not as elevated in our emotions, and we're at a place that we can then turn around and be a parent to our child, an imperfect one, right? Like we can't be the perfect parent that God is. We can be an imperfect parent to our children. And bonus is that sitting in God's presence really can't really do much except for humble us, right? Like when we are comparing ourselves to God, our parenting to God, our existence to God, we can't help but be humbled. So it's much easier after you've spent time in God's presence to go to your child and say, I'm sorry that I reacted that way when I first found out. You didn't deserve that. That wasn't right. If I could go back and change it, I would. Or I'm sorry that you felt like you couldn't come talk to me about this. I really want to figure out what we can change in our family dynamic to make sure that we can be transparent with each other, even if we disagree, right? Let's work this out together. It's a lot easier after you've spent time in God's presence to get to that place of humility and to even expose that humility to others, including our children.
And it's so crazy as you're talking through all of this. In the emergency room, my mom had actually come and sat with me and my son in the emergency room. And it's really interesting because she was still parenting me as I was parenting my child.
Yeah.
And it did give me a very clear visual of that relationship with God, where the same way that I wanted, like the same way my mom was treating me, which was like, hey, I'm here for you. I love you. I know this is hard. It's going to be okay. I then had the courage to do that for my son who was going through these hard things. And it wasn't that she didn't stop all of her feelings and her emotions, but like, she was like, I'm sad with you. Like, I'm here with you. I'm sitting with you. And I think what you're saying is like, wow, even the comfort that God can give us and he feels with us. And I think sometimes that's hard to do. It's hard to know that God feels with us and wants to experience our emotions with us when we're in the hustle and bustle of life, because we don't stop to reflect on like who he is. Like, oh, you are a God who sees and a God who feels and a God who wants to be with us.
Yeah.
Based on how you view God. And so it also is like a reshifting of how we view him. We're like, whoa, you're actually here with me. You feel with me. You're walking with me. And you are filling me up and giving me more of the Holy Spirit to then ask my child these hard questions or to figure out a path forward for our family. I just think that it's, there's no way. I mean, I guess there is if you have gnarly coping mechanisms, but like there's no way you could get through life and these really, really big things, whether it's happening to you or even just processing where the world is at right now. Like there's no way that you can do that without stopping and resting with God. I mean, I don't see a path for it. Maybe I'm wrong, but
yeah, I love that. You know, what it makes me think about is, I just said this in a different podcast, so maybe that's why it's coming to my mind, but you know, the Bible says so many times, do not fear, do not be afraid, which of course is completely impossible, especially if you're a mom who has a child that went to the hospital and had to have all these scary things happen to him. And so I hate saying that. I used to hate saying that in the Bible, do not be afraid, do not fear, because it just feels impossible. Like I can't do that. And I think what I really love is that in Psalm 41:10, God tells us why we shouldn't be afraid. He says, do not fear, for I am with you. And didn't that make all the difference when you were in the hospital with your mom, right? That you weren't alone and it was up to you to, navigate your child through this, that you had your own support, someone in the trenches with you going through this, knowing what it feels like to be a mom going through this. That made all the difference, and then allowed you to pour out your heart to your son because you had your support there, right? Do not be afraid because you're not alone in this. I am with you. And I think that's what Sabbath does, is it reminds us, do not be afraid. That's what God has called us to. But the reason is because of who he is and who we are. He is with us at all moments. And I think practicing that, like we said before, every week during a Sabbath moment, during a Sabbath time, then gets us in the habit of during the week when life hits us big and strong, turning to God and remembering, I don't need to be afraid in this moment because I have some support. I am not alone. You are with me. So I think it's so important, all those facets of our reality, of the unseen reality of our lives as Christians. God is with us. We don't need to be afraid. We have a hope that's way higher than this world. All of those truths we forget all throughout the week. We need to be reminded of them in a big way every week. Then we need to get in the habit of turning to God for those truths in the day-to-day when life hits us fast and strong.
Well, Ellen, thank you so much for the rich conversation around Sabbath and also how it intersects with sexuality and also like some of these really big life moments. And even to this parent who submitted this question, we see you, we know this is a hard time. Like we hope that directing you to have more rest and richness with God will allow you to help rebuild that trust with your child, even through what hard moments that might also bring for you. But yes, we thank you to all of our listeners who joined us today. We look forward to seeing you next time.